Hello everyone, I'm Simon Ralphs, real estate partner at Clark's Legal. Welcome to this webinar, which is entitled From Food Van to Restaurant. Here's a brief outline of what I'll be talking about today. So initially the street food revolution, then we'll move on to short-term lease or license, and then some other key legal issues that we need to consider. At the end of the webinar, I'll deal with any questions you might have, so please type any questions in the questions drop down on your dashboard, as shown on this slide. The street food revolution. So, new street food markets continue to open across the UK at a rapid pace, and many new food trucks and vendors are opening each week. How can landlords, developers and food entrepreneurs take advantage of this trend, and how is the sector evolving? London is leading the way on the street food scene, and currently there are approximately 40 regular food markets in the inner London area. There are a few established types of street food operations, with the most common being either public street markets or privately owned land and buildings. So street markets, these will usually be on a local authority owned street or land, such as car parks or public parks and gardens. One example in London is the White Cross street food market, which, although it's been in existence for many years, continues to attract crowds of hungry lunchtime workers. Street markets such as this will be regulated by the local council by way of a street trading licence, and each trader is likely to have a specified pitch for a fixed period. Next up, privately owned land and buildings. These will often be sites that are earmarked for redevelopment, or simply a site where a landlord sees the benefit of occupying some hard-to-let space with a street food event. Also, more developers are trying to bring a balance to living and working environments with retail and food outlets, and they see a real benefit from bringing in street food vendors to add some character to these areas. A great example of this would be the expansion of Curb, which Curb describes itself as a membership organisation for London's most exciting street cooks, which started out on part of the development land at King's Cross. And in many ways, the members have helped the emergence of Granary Square as a go-to foodie destination. Since then, they've expanded further with regular markets across London, including at the base of the Gherkin building in the city. Most street food vendors will ideally aim to operate in both of these types of location. Now, there are a few legal considerations for landowners and the food vendors themselves. So firstly, short-term lease or license. It's likely that the trader will be new to the market or first-time occupiers, and so a short tenancy or pop-up license may be preferred. This means less financial commitment and more flexibility to see how the business develops. This is not always attractive to a landlord, but they're beginning to realise that short-term lets can bring a rejuvenating buzz to a poorly rented area and also attract other potential tenants. Also, if successful, it is likely the trader will be happy to take a longer lease once the short-term arrangement ends. As you might expect, a lease is likely to tie the operator in for a longer term and contain some additional or more detailed obligations. Whether the landlord requires the trader to enter into a lease or a license to occupy, here are some key issues that will still need to be considered either way. Rent. This will usually be payable either monthly or quarterly in advance. Sometimes a tenant can agree a rent that is inclusive of all other expenses such as service charge, insurance and rates. Often on longer term leases, the landlord will require a review of the rent, generally once every 5 years on an upwards only basis, to the greater of the current rent and the market rent at the time of the review. Service charge. If the property forms part of a larger building or has areas that are used in common by you and other tenants, then it's likely the tenant will be required to pay towards the cost of these through the service charge. Tenants therefore might want to consider agreeing a cap on their contribution or certain exclusions to keep any liabilities down. Insurance. Usually the landlord will be responsible for insuring the property, and the operator will be required to repay their proportion. The trader will need to obtain third-party insurance and also ensure they're protected if there is damage that prevents them trading, or if damage is caused by something the landlord has not insured against. VAT. It's likely that the landlord will be registered for VAT and charging this on top of the rent, and so the operator will need to consider whether they should register for VAT to enable them to recover any of this VAT that they spend. Business rate. A landlord will be keen to fill a vacant unit, not just to receive some income, but also to pass on the business rates liability to the tenant. However, as touched on above, you may seek to avoid this extra cost by agreeing an all-inclusive rent. Security of tenure. A landlord is likely to insist that any lease is excluded from the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954, meaning that you as tenant would not have an automatic right to renew your term when it expires. You would therefore need to negotiate new terms upon expiry of the lease if you wish to stay at your premises. Next, dilapidations and repairing obligations. Often a tenant is required to keep the property in good repair and condition and to ensure the property is returned in that state at the end of the term. It is a good idea for the tenant to agree a schedule of condition when they take the lease to ensure no potentially onerous rectification requirements are imposed on them at term end. Next up, rights. It's crucial that the lease or license grants the operator the rights they need to operate. Items such as seating outside the demise, signage, car parking and access are some of the important issues that need to be considered. Alterations and fit out. The landlord will want to approve any alterations to the property, and this means the proposed fit out will need to be considered by them too. Often they'll need to see plans and a specification and will require a separate license for alterations documenting any and consenting to the proposals. Break rights. It may be decided that the tenant wants the ability to terminate the lease earlier than the full term. This can be useful if they're not sure how well they will trade and gives them added flexibility. Often a landlord will require a few months' notice and insist that the property is vacant and all rents are paid up to date. Sometimes a landlord will also insist on a penalty payment should you decide to break the lease. Next up, assigning or underletting. Another way of passing on obligations under the lease is having the ability to assign it to another party or to grant an underlease to another party. To do this, the tenant will probably also need to get the landlord's consent. Next, permitted use and planning. Some key consideration will need to be the use of the trader that intends to put the property to and the extent of the proposed works. If the existing use needs changing, the building is listed, or the fit-out works are potentially substantial, then it's probable that the planning consent will be required. Also, the restaurant will need to have a valid premises or liquor license in place. These requirements will obviously need to be considered early on, as it could cause potential delays to the eventual opening. So that's a quick, speedy run-through of some key considerations you'll need to think about. So let's see if we've had any questions. So here's one. Jane has asked if it's possible to agree a lease or license with the landlord without the need of a solicitor. Well, I'm obviously bound to say that you should always get a lawyer to look over your documents, but you also need to consider that the lease or license could attract some stamp duty, SDLT, and depending on the length of the term, there could also be a need for the document to be registered at the land registry. And so I'd always recommend that you use a solicitor at the very least to deal with those aspects. Okay, next there's a question from Fiona who says she's looking to launch a new food van soon and is using it to test her product before considering taking on a permanent site. She wants to know if I have any tips for finding good sites for a van. Well, actually, it's definitely worth you trying the likes of Curb and Street Feast, and also checking with your local council to see if they have any available pitches. There's also a company called Street Dots, who are also a relatively new concept that you should probably check out. They have an app for traders to book spots at various sites across London on a day-by-day basis. So that's probably something worth looking into as well. Okay, I think that seems to be all for now on the questions, but here is my email address should anyone need to get in touch with me or have any questions after the webinar. Also, you'll see the Clark's Legal Real Estate Twitter accounts there, so please do follow us, and we'll be sure to follow you back. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.